They were carried into battle. People died to save them from destruction. This is their story. This is the heart of the ancient palace of the popes of Rome. It's centuries older than the Vatican and filled with holy wonders. Believers say that Jesus Christ once walked upon these steps, that they were taken from Pontius Pilate's palace in Jerusalem. The steps were brought to Rome in the first centuries of Christianity and are reverenced still by millions of people every year who pass up them on their knees, deep in penitential prayer. Inside the ancient chapel at their top, Rome's most holy picture, an image made, so it was said, not by human hands at all. A portrait so powerful that when, deep in the Dark Ages, the barbarians stood at the gates of ancient Rome, the awe-inspiring image crippled the tribesmen with its paralyzing gaze and sent them running back to Germany. The painting's entirely encased in silver. The nearest you can get to it is that little face on the top, which is actually painted on linen and lays right on the ancient panel. And that type of face, a round one with dark hair, is probably the nearest you can get to an authentic portrait of Jesus. The original was said to have been painted on the walls of Pontius Pilate's palace by the first Christians. The real painting, underneath, it's been entirely washed away 1,000 years ago. That doesn't matter, really. This is more than a picture. It is literally a window into heaven, a link between divinity and the earth. The Romans call their painting the Acheropita, an ancient Eastern word that means a picture made in heaven. It was actually made in the 7th century in the Empire of Byzantium, part of a standard set of pictures of the people of the Bible. All those images come from the East. They're our most basic images of kings and gods and governments, of heroes and mothers and villains, all those types we take for granted. And their story of how they got from the East to the modern West is an astonishing tale. They've come through fire. It's a story of blindings and hatreds and the light of faith. It's our story, and it's a part of the story of Byzantium too. The story starts in the year 360. Just a few years after the Roman Empire had accepted Christianity, when a pagan pilgrim came here to the Greek sanctuary of Delphi to ask the god Apollo if the ancient pagan images would ever again be honored and worshipped in the ancient ways. Deep down, under Apollo's vast temple, an old lady sat, filled with the fumes from a volcanic crack underneath and drugged with cyanide. She babbled a reply, and a priest took down her words in classic verse. Tell the world the glorious temple has fallen. Apollo's springs are dry. The world no longer has a prophet. Using the signs and symbols of the ancient gods, Apollo's priest had just announced the ending of the pagan world.
In the pagan world, the gods controlled everything. From the movements of the stars in the sky to the fishes in the sea. And their signs and symbols were everywhere. They protected crops and trees. They were in every stone. When the thunder came down, you understood it because it belonged to a god, and every god had its sign. It was a complete universe, and everybody felt secure in it. When Christianity took over the Roman Empire, it attacked and swept away all these signs. Now, these signs were as old as man himself, and Christianity was pretty poorly supplied with alternatives. After all, it was a language of books and words. But unless it was to fail, it had to develop, and develop quickly, a whole new set of images for the world. The trick, the genius, you might say, wasn't just to swap this ancient chaos of 10,000 pagan signs and symbols for a single set of Christian images, but to find a quick way of spreading these Christian images and pictures right through the ancient Mediterranean. Books. Books were the answer. Books were invented at the same time that Christianity started. Before that, there were scrolls. Now there were pages. This is a copy of one of the oldest books in the world, from the first centuries of Christianity. Look, if you flip through it, you see pictures. They're illustrating the narrative. If that would have been a Christian book, it could have gone from one end of the Mediterranean to the other and taken a whole set of Christian pictures, a story for the walls of a church. Well, that's just a copy. These images, these ancient images, are so precious that real books of that age, from the 5th century, some of the oldest pictures in the world that have come from books, are now not in books but trapped in glass. Look, here is Jupiter. This is a pagan book illustrating pagan poetry, and it's a picture of Jupiter, the king of the gods, and he's got a halo, just like Christian saints will have in their pictures. And he's holding a globe, just like Christ will in 1,000 churches. And he's sitting under the ark of heaven, as Christ does. And he's king of the stars and the moon and the sun. This is a pose which says to you, king. You can't have Jesus, king of the world, unless he looks like a king. That looks like a king. That's where they're getting, as it were, their iconography from, straight from the pagan faith. Now look at this. Here's another one of these very precious ancient illustrations, really the roots of our Western art. Think of that. When you make gestures today, when you go victory or communism, fascism, bang, bang, you're doing universal gestures. They get emotions in you immediately. This said to the early Christians similar sorts of things. Look, here is a Roman general and his mistress and a friend having dinner. They're sitting round a table, they've got halos on. Everybody would know this was an imperial table. There's a way of drawing tables, even with a fish on a plate in the middle. You'll see that in churches. You'll see that same image, except there, it becomes the Last Supper. The first imperial images to tell the stories of the Christian Bible, to symbolize its faith, came from this city, 1,000 miles to the east of Rome. Ancient Constantinople, now Istanbul in modern Turkey. The Emperor Constantine the Great dedicated this column when he founded Constantinople in the year 330. From that year on, the city stood at the heart of Constantine's vast empire, the first Christian state, master of the greatest cities the world had ever seen, Alexandria, Antioch and Rome, and the capital of the brand new empire of Byzantium. From the very beginning, Constantinople really sizzled. New religion, new state, new government, everything here was up for grabs. Amazingly enough, we have a good idea of how it felt to be alive inside this city, and at just this time in history. It's a 1,500-year-old press photo. It's not on film, though. It's on ivory. There's the pulp of the poor old elephant's tusk. The Byzantines imported ivory from India and from Africa. This probably came from Africa because it's so enormous. Would have come, of course, through Egypt, up through the empire to Constantinople.
The Byzantines loved ivory. They thought it had a texture like living skin. This, then, is the only glimpse we have of life in Constantinople in about the year 420. It's a procession. Two priests are carrying the bones of St. Stephen of Jerusalem on a royal carriage into the imperial palace of Byzantium. The mighty emperor Theodosius II is walking with his ministers and soldiers right through the center of the city.
Theodosius' procession would have passed up this very street. This is modern Istanbul. In those days, in the 5th century, it was called Constantinople. We're walking between the docks and the ancient centre of the city. I suspect it was much the same in those days, but there would have been thousands of people watching the emperor on his way to the palace. Do you know, these processions, especially at that time, were a very tense affair. These sort of cities, these great classical cities, were 1,000 years old. But the Christian bishops that ran them were starting to look at them with brand new eyes. The times really were a-changing. They saw the rich on the way to church to tend to their souls, kicking beggars out the way by the doors of the church, children mutilated by their parents to make them look more pitiful. And they saw the rich women walking, they said, with 1,000 meals swinging from their ears. And they didn't like what they saw. The Christian bishops wanted a moral city, a sexless city, a pure city, and a more equitable city too.
So that, perhaps, is why the emperor isn't sitting in his carriage, but walking in the street and carrying a candle with his courtiers. And the bones of a poor man from Palestine are riding in the royal coach. The emperor's procession was on its way to a grand square, halfway between the palace and the court church.
I think our ivory procession would have passed through here.